So our next panel is about the NASA Moving to Mars objectives. You may recall last year, NASA released their initial objectives, and it had, I believe, 4,400 groups submitted suggestions to modify them. They listened to all the suggestions and re-released them again. So today we have a great panel to talk about what they are and where we're going from here with these objectives and how they will help us get back to the moon and on to Mars. Moderating this panel, somebody most of you know from Space News, Jeff Foust. Jeff is literally the person, well, from a certain perspective, the guy who opened the door to the space community to me. You know, back at the latter part of the last century, when I was just entering the space community, I went to this, my first chapter meeting of the Boston chapter of the National Space Society, which was in the old MIT Media building. And I kept knocking on the door. The door was always locked, so somebody had to let you in. I was probably there 5 minutes knocking on the door. And finally, Jeff Foust came and literally opened the door. And he was actually the first person I met within the space community more years ago than I wanted to admit. So, Jeff?
Thanks, Chris. I think that's Chris's way of saying it's all my fault that you're here. So. But thank you for staying here through to the last session of the afternoon. It's been, I know it's a long day. Only thing tougher being the last session before lunch is being the last session before the Scotch tasting session. But promise they're not going to be serving anything until after we're done. So no need to rush out. If you were here at last year's Humans to Mars conference, you might remember that NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy spoke. And she spoke the same day that NASA released an initial set of objectives for its Moon to Mars exploration efforts. And in the years since then, there has been a lot of effort to refine and expand those objectives and use those objectives as a basis for an architecture to guide those efforts. And so what we're going to be talking about here is where we stand in terms of that architecture and sort of the next steps and related activities associated with that and how all that will lead to humans to Mars. And so we have Kurt Spuds Vogel. He is Director of Space Architectures at NASA headquarters. You know you're living in the future when you have a job title called Director of Space Architectures. Sounds like something that Starfleet would have, but we have that here now. It's great. And Bhavya is back up here on stage. If you're here this morning, she was up on stage as moderator. Now she gets to be a panelist as Associate Administrator for Technology, Policy, and Strategy. So Spuds and Bhavya are going to spend a few minutes each. They're going to go through a few slides, talk about some of these topics, and then we're going to dive into some Q&A, a fireside chat without a fire at our side. It's a virtual fire. Talk about that, and then we will open it up to some audience Q&A towards the end, because I'm sure that for all the questions I have, you probably have some better questions. So Spuds, why don't we start with you? And we've got the clicker here.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having us. This is my first time coming to the Humans to Mars, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of the talks over the next couple of days. But as Jeff said, some of you may have seen the objectives already at the Paris IAC last fall. Pam had announced what that final version was. But just last month, about a month ago today, we released the full strategy document that explains not only the objectives and the rationale behind them, a little bit more detail than what was originally sent, but the strategy behind it. And then later last month, only a couple weeks ago, was released the architecture development document, or the architecture description document, which is the first round, if you will, of where we go from this strategy. So to kind of explain, in the spirit of what's next, let's talk about where we were headed, what the guidepost is. And so if you've seen this document, I apologize, this might be the third, fourth, fifth time you've heard it. But for those that haven't, just a real quick review. What we did is the methodology for the strategy is guided by a robust systems engineering process and 5 interrelated principles. The robust systems engineering process is represented by this graphic, which is basically to say, let's step back and understand the what. What is it that we're trying to accomplish here? We don't want that to change all the time. We want it to be consistent over multiple administrations. And what we're setting out for is to create almost a decadal-like methodology for this strategy that would be evolutionary as well along the way as we build it, because this is a long period of time that we have to accomplish getting all the way and doing the Mars campaign. So you start with the what when you do the systems engineering, but undergirding that what is the why form on the bottom. So this is the value proposition, and I know the print on this is pretty small. You may not be able to read it, and if you've seen any of Pam Melroy's talks, you'll know that platform of why is the motivation. What motivates us for going to do this? And it's the three pillars to that why platform are inspiration, national posture, and science. Of course, science leads the whole thing. In fact, you're going to see it reflected in nearly 40% of the objectives that we come up with. But once that why is established, the system engineering process then mandates determine the what. Let's make sure it's rigorously developed so that we know it's reasonably achievable. Let's make sure it's detailed enough so we know how to judge success. And let's do what we can to make sure this doesn't change over time. Once we've done that, then the how kicks in. So the what develops that platform of why, and then how we do it. Well, the how is done by in most circumstances, it's something akin to a program office. And at NASA, that is the ESD mission directorate led by Jim Free and his folks. And of course, you have to have sufficient funding to get the job done. And to fill out those elements of the how, you have to have a steady stream of technology that's developed over time. And that's why we have multiple streams of technology development, including an entire mission directorate at NASA, as well as industry, academia, international partners. There's even the program office itself has tech development capabilities. If you see that QR code up there, if you haven't seen the whole strategy, I highly encourage you to take a scan of it, and you can peruse this at your leisure. But as I mentioned, we had to define the what. And so, and that what is the first element of these 5 interrelated principles I'm talking about, which is to be objective-based. NASA has pivoted from a capabilities-based to an objective-based approach. When we had to look to the right, if you will, I'll go all the way to the right if you were looking at it from a schedule vernacular, and say, what is it we're trying to accomplish? And that looks, at first blush, you'd say that's pretty broad, and it is. But we're not just going, there's people that are very focused on the moon. There's some people very focused on Mars. We're at a Mars event here. It's neither of those. What we're doing is we're developing a blueprint for sustained human presence and exploration throughout the solar system. We're practicing on the moon, in part. That's one of the reasons we're going to the moon. But also, we're not just stopping at Mars. That is a demonstration, that initial campaign is a demonstration of this blueprint that we're trying to establish here. So if that's the what, if that's the ultimate goal, is that the complete what? No, I'd say it probably isn't. That gets us into the second of the 5 principles, which is to be we start with an objective base. We've got that bumper sticker, if you will, all the way to the right. But then as you start to decompose that or deconstruct that and come left from that, as you architect from the right, that's the second principle. Architect from the right. Start with that goal and then start decomposing and ask yourself at each layer, what does it take to do that? As you define these top-level goals and objectives, what does it take to do that? And you keep working your way left until you get that wireframe that you see up there, and then it's at that point that you start injecting the technology solutions, the acquisition approaches and whatnot, and that's when you get that mosaic of who's doing what. Once you've got that plan established, you want to make sure you're honoring the third principle, which is to be consistent. Everything that we're doing here is designed to be resilient. Resilient to our budgets, resilient to the technology. As technology comes on board, we want to be resilient on the technology solutions. We want to be credible in what we're saying. And all of that feeds into a political resilience. That regardless, because of the time scales that we're living under here on a project of this magnitude, that regardless of how many administrations we go through, we have the same answer. We're trying to get after the same goal. To do that, we have to honor the fourth principle, which is we have to be unified. Meaning everybody inside and outside the agency has to understand and be able to articulate what the plan is. And that includes from the development of these objectives and goals all the way down to the plan itself. We have to be unified in this. And the way that's going to happen is the 5th principle, is through enhanced communication and engagement. I would argue it's the single most important one. After you've established that we need to be objective-based, making sure that we're talking with each other, including getting feedback from folks about what we're doing on a regular basis, and having the different voices involved, that's what's going to make the difference between success and failure for getting these goals achieved. So just take a step back then and let's ask ourselves, what is the scope? When the Federated Board, which I chair at NASA, the Federated Board is made up of the deputies of all the mission directorates at NASA, to come up with that initial set of top-level goals and objectives. Well, we had to ask ourselves, what's the scope? And as Jeff had mentioned, when we came up with the first round of these objectives in the spring of last year, there was about 45 objectives, and we had to decide what that scope was. Well, I mentioned already there's some people who are very fixated, just the moon. We're going to go to the moon and don't worry about what's after that. We just got to get to the moon. There's some people that say do the absolute minimum, maybe folks here, do the absolute minimum or don't even do the moon. Let's just get on to Mars. I submit to you that every domain that human history is replete with examples of every time we go into a new domain, we do a couple of things. We get there, we learn how to survive there at first, we learn how to get there, survive there, then eventually we learn how to thrive and be productive, and in some cases an economy is driven around that domain, but we're also starting to plan for what the next step is. We did it in Leo, we're going to do it on the moon as well. So every one of these domains, if you treat the moon and Mars as domains, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to go there, we're going to learn how to survive and then eventually thrive. And at the same time, we're going to be doing analog activities and preparing ourselves for the next domain, which in this case would be Mars, where we're going to do the initial demo of this blueprint. So that's what you see the scope here. It's really both the human presence, the sustained human presence, as well as practice for our Mars demo. And then when we get to Mars, it's going to be the same thing. It's interesting that when we came out with this first set of objectives, though, part of the feedback we got back, we had a huge set of 4 campaigns of getting feedback, including international, industry, academia. Most of you probably were involved in this. We got over 5,000 inputs, and part of that input that we took in and made changes was we modified the scope a little bit. We originally had just left it to the initial demo on Mars, whereas now we're saying, no, we need to at least put the hooks in for the sustained human presence part for Mars as well. Keeping in mind that this is something that's going to grow over time, and I'm sure that in another 10-ish years, we'll take another look at this, and that might even grow further. But that's where we stood on the scope. This is not meant for you to read. This is just to give you an idea of what those top-level goals. There's 10 top-level goals as you decompose off of that blueprint statement. There are a total of 63 objectives spread out over those 10 top-level goals. All of those you can see on the online. If you grabbed a capture of that QR code, you'll be able to see all of these goals and objectives in detail online. So as far as then real quickly going into what the next steps are, is with those objectives determined and the methodology driven by those strategic principles, we now start this process that now Jim Free and his organization, ESDMD, now has the lead on driving this annual cycle of architecture concept reviews. We're going to do them every year. We did the first one in January. We actually had a Delta ACR in February following on that, based on the feedback we got at the ACR internally at NASA. But from now on, that ACR cycle is going to happen in the fall timeframe to align with budget cycles. But what you're going to see is that wireframe is kind of showing pictorially here. It starts off with a little bit of it developed, a little bit of it informed, and then each year we're going to keep building on the next phases to make sure that we get the entire story built. I think you all would think we were being disingenuous if we came out after only a few months and said, here's the whole architecture. That's not realistic when you look at all the different phases that we have to go through. In fact, they named out 4 different segments. The first one, focused ACR 22, the one that we had in January, was specifically on the human lunar return. And so that was on these early Artemis missions. Is the foundational exploration and the sustained lunar development. That is basically adding more capabilities, expanding more complex activities on the moon, including Mars analog activity, as well as global utilization, et cetera. And then finally, the 4th segment is Mars. Now, interestingly enough, and this is my the last slide, but that last segment is what is going to be the heavy focus on ACR 23, the one that is going on right now. And it's a very short one because we had to shorten up that cycle to only 9 months this year. And by the time we got done, and getting it reported out, they've only got a few months to actually get into this next round. But that 4th segment, the Humans to Mars, thank you very much. the Humans to Mars is actually the heavy focus of ACR 23. So that's where we're going.
Thank you. Let me see if this one works. Okay, well, I'm keenly aware, good afternoon, I'm keenly aware we all stand between you and Scotch, so. Is Elise Bosham in here? I don't see her. Well, I want to give a shout out to Elise, my colleagues Gabriel Swinney and Katie McBriar, whose work I would be talking about a little bit today. Where's the clicker?
Oh, right there.
Okay, so Spuds just told you about what NASA plans to do in the Moon to Mars domain, right? So we now need to think about what these operations will mean for NASA and for humanity. And we need to think about their broader implications. We need to make sure that as we achieve these technical and scientific goals, we also build a future aligned with our values and in the best interest of humanity. So I'm here to talk about these issues, what we lovingly call in the space community policy issues. Spuds mentioned the 63 objectives. The question is, do any of them raise any policy implications, any policy considerations? Because if so, we need to plan not only for technical and scientific success in achieving these goals, but also do things such that we don't encounter any unanticipated roadblocks. For example, related to a treaty that we may have signed, and also so we build the kind of future that supports the values of the United States. So the work I'm talking about is ongoing, and I'd like to share a preview of our findings. So, again, and you thought Spuds slides were hard to read. Again, I don't intend for you to read this slide. So what you see on the left side are each of the 63 objectives in the Moon to Mars plans. And you can see those categories, lunar planetary science, heliophysics. So there's 4 categories, right? Science, infrastructure, operations, and what's the fourth one? Transportation.
Trans and Hab operations.
Trans and Hab, right, yeah. Our deputy administrator gave us a challenge for each of the objectives, what might be policy considerations. And we went through each one of them, and turns out that they kind of aggregate into about a dozen areas of interest. So that's partly the good news. It's not it's not infinite number of policy issues to examine, but just a small number doesn't mean that that they are easy to address. So I will begin with just some that apply to a lot of them, some overarching considerations. One of them is that we need to protect what we are informally calling special locations. That is, locations on the Moon or Mars that have rare or unique characteristics. These are areas like permanently shadowed regions, the so-called peaks of eternal light. By the way, no such thing as peaks of eternal light. They're not eternal light, I guess is what I'm saying. That might be especially useful for solar power. Or the far side of the Moon, which radio astronomers would like to use as a radio quiet zone. These are places for which there's a lot of interest, but that limited area or situations where having certain missions operate, well, that would make it harder or impossible to complete another objective. For these special locations, the space community has a set of tasks ahead of us. We need to identify these locations, develop some level of consensus about what they are, and somehow use them most effectively, while not negatively impacting the ability of others or even ourselves in the future to operate. So that's the first one you see. Another policy consideration that the team identified is how NASA shares the data it collects with the world. Now, as you well know, NASA has a long-standing and very expansive scientific data transparency policy, and we are perhaps the most transparent space agency in the world. But consider this. Not every NASA mission is going to materialize as a NASA mission on the Moon or Mars. Sometimes, often, for example, in the case of CLPS, a Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, these missions will be done by industry working under contract for us. Sometimes they will carry NASA scientific instruments, but other times NASA will simply buy scientific data from commercial providers just as we would another service. So now new questions arise. How do our data transparency policies apply to data that we purchase rather than collecting it ourselves? Must we? Or should we pay industry providers specifically for data that we can make public to the world? We found that even policy considerations NASA has traditionally excelled in resolving. For example, we've addressed this issue in commercial data buys and for remote sensing, has special wrinkles in the Moon to Mars context. Another overarching policy consideration is planetary protection. How do we make sure we protect the Moon and Mars from Earth contamination? And again, remember, we are not worrying, at least in the way we've defined planetary protection, we're not worrying about protecting those celestial bodies. We're talking about protecting our long-term scientific interests. How do we make sure we do that? And also, how do we not bring back harmful contamination back from these bodies? Now, NASA already has guidelines in place for protecting these celestial bodies, and they're actually quite complex and very well vetted in the scientific community. However, they were designed when almost entirely robotic science activities were contemplated. If NASA and our partners move beyond that paradigm, as in take humans to Mars, as is the title of this conference, what does it even mean to protect the Moon or Mars from harmful contamination that humans would bring? How do we make sure the materials we bring back, or the humans we bring back, don't bring back something that affects the Earth's biosphere? And this is the question that keeps me up at night. What if implementing close to perfect sample containment measures would enormously increase the cost of that mission to the point of making it affordable? As you know, we are bringing back samples from Mars, and we need to be very carefully thinking about that. The space community has been struggling with these questions for years now. But as we move forward with our operations, particularly as we begin planning a Mars campaign in earnest, we are going to have to create answers, not just more questions. Fourth one, the last overarching point I want to make, is that space policy implicates questions about what it means to explore the solar system in the first place. We must always remember that what we are doing here has broader impacts to society, which means that we need to think about the social and ethical implications of our plans. I'm proud to say that NASA recently organized a research workshop on Artemis and ethics, and we will use insights from that to inform our policy process. And again, if folks are interested in that work, just reach out and we'll find a way to get that to you. So let's go into some specifics. One objective that has a number of policy considerations, and again, I will be going a little bit more granular in the issues that I just brought up. So physics and physical science. This objective is about conducting astrophysics and fundamental physics investigations of space and time from the radio-quiet environment of the lunar far side. This is one where protecting the valuable location of the lunar far side is a key policy consideration, since it depends on maintaining that radio-quiet zone. As a result, we will need to have policies in place to coordinate our operations and to avoid interference amongst actors to help protect the location. We also need to make sure we share as much information as possible about the data collected from fulfilling this objective so that all of humanity can benefit from the knowledge gathered from such a unique opportunity. There are also cultural and ethical considerations that come into play with what we could learn from a radio-quiet zone telescope, but also the repercussions of enforcing such a zone. And finally, there are policy considerations over how NASA should partner with international other space agencies, the commercial sector, to complete such a mission. A second set of objectives where policy is very relevant relates to the entire category of infrastructure. Building infrastructure on another celestial body is a massive task. There are a limited number of areas around the lunar South Pole, for example, that have many of the characteristics needed to meet the objectives. Areas with high percentage of sunlight, near permanently shadowed regions and craters, with consistent direct-to-Earth communications that can be readily accessible from Gateway, which, as you all know, is the space station around the moon. Many different actors are interested in sending missions to these areas, so we will need coordination and communication and engagement, to use Spuds' language, with all parties to figure out how to responsibly handle all of this activity. There are also important concerns about sustainability, because we are sending a lot down there, and actually the definition here I'm using of sustainability is the UN definition, sort of balancing the needs of today with that of the future. So I know there's that term means a lot of different things to different people. So we have concerns about sustainability because we are sending a lot down there on the moon and Mars, and we don't want to turn these bodies into a junkyard. So, of course, identifying policy considerations and linking them to our Moon to Mars objectives, which is what we have done and we are kind of getting more deeply into, it's just a start. The real work of addressing these policy considerations has to begin. And again, we need to start thinking about answers and not just more questions, as I said earlier. The good news is that we have a general idea of what questions we need to answer, and we have begun collaborating with our international partners on activities such as deconfliction. The work NASA is doing gives us a policy roadmap to follow that aligns with our Moon to Mars objectives for our operations. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say they are just two different ways of looking at the same journey. Either way, to paraphrase an old boss of mine in more polite words, now it's time to get to work. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks. A lot of food for thought there in both of those presentations. I'm going to start off with a few questions, and like I said, a little bit later on, turn it over to the audience. Spuds, I'll start with you. It's been about a month, as you said, since the release of the initial architecture report. Just curious if you can give what sort of feedback you've gotten either from within the agency or from industry or international partners about the report, what they liked about it, what they hoped to see and didn't find, or what they found and didn't expect to see, anything like that.
Yeah, should I use this one? Okay. So, double mic'd. I have lots to say, I guess. Most of it from the inside, and I will tell you the reason why we even had a Delta ACR. We had some things we wanted to kind of refine a little bit, but not surprisingly, I showed that there's the 4 different segments, and anything that someone thought maybe have been missing or whatnot, it's because it wasn't the target in this first ACR, that we couldn't tackle it all at once. So you can imagine that the feedback inside and out would be, hey, the science piece of it, we want to make sure that we hit that. That's going to be a focus going forward, the Mars particular. And even so some of those activities that are going to be on the moon early on are still, it's not completely devoid in the early missions of Artemis. There's still some things that they would like to see even in those early segments. So I'd say that's probably one area. But and the answer to that is always just, it is patience. It's not something that we could bite off and get it all done in one shot. So having said that, I think, and I use this term a lot, I even used it when we were back in the green room there, is like, I think folks generally, inside and out, have their hand hovering over the I believe button, right? This is a sea change in the way NASA's doing business. And rightfully so, people are like, okay, well, is this real or not? I'm here to tell you it's real. We're coming from, I mean, this is, Pam is an incredible change agent. We got the support of the administrator, the associate administrator, and the deputy administrator, that we're on a different way on a different path and doing business in a different way. So it does mean patience for both people inside and out to let this bake and see this through. But yeah, initially there's going to be some things that are going to be missing, and it's not because they're not being thought of. We're going to be grading ourselves against those objectives. Science is 40% of those objectives. We're going to grade ourselves against them, so they'll be there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Bhavya, you gave, there's a lot of policy issues you brought up there. That one chart, I think, illustrated that very well. As part of this effort, what are are you going to be proposing solutions? What are they look like? Will they be, sort of things that can be done internal to NASA involving higher policy level issues? We just had a panel here on the Artemis Accords earlier this afternoon. Or is that something that the Artemis Accords can help resolve?
Great question, Jeff. So across, it's all of the above, right? Depends on the particular policy issue. The one on planetary protection, for example, we have a COSPAR framework on how we think about planetary protection. So we would need to both work internally within NASA. We would need to work with the space community, commercial entities, international partners, and then update COSPAR rules, because it doesn't help if NASA in the United States is following one set of rules, but the rest of the world isn't. If we're going to protect, not contaminate or create harmful contamination or not bring it back, we need the whole world to go together, right? So we need to coordinate pretty carefully with the rest of the world. Some things can be done just potentially within NASA. For example, the CLIPS program, the contracts we write can include some things that may help guide them. Some of them would need to come from regulations that are right now under being developed at the White House, the National Space Council, right? So in-space authorization and supervision, it's something that Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty requires us to do. And once that kind of umbrella is in place, some policy issues would get resolved. So short answer is all of the above, and we are keen to begin working with all partners, most of all with folks within the ESDMD and across the board directorates, right? SMD, STMD, to make sure that internally NASA is working together to make sure that we are on the same page, as I think Spuds says, unity of purpose. And then we need to move out and bring our partners on board. To your specific question on Artemis Accords partners, that is especially important. And even things like deconflicting, landing zones, right? 3 partners want to land on the same site, and the lunar south, the moon's big, but there's very few places on the lunar south pole where you can easily land. We absolutely need to deconflict, and we start with our Artemis Accords partners. And then obviously over time we need to be able to talk to our adversaries as well, because it is in our best interest that our astronauts and our robotic missions are safe.
And I guess the question that brings in both of you on this is that how does this examination of policy issues then feed into the architecture concept review in terms of either enabling or disabling certain functions or use cases or things like that emerge as part of the architecture review?
So I'll say this. One thing I did not explicitly spell out in my charts. I didn't highlight the fact that in addition to the 63 objectives are also 9 recurring tenets. These are common themes. This also came back from the feedback that we got last summer. We added these recurring tenets because these were things that we fundamentally assumed, but our feedback we were getting from partners, industry, academia, and whatnot said, and international partners said, no, we need to actually spell those things out. So you'll notice if you go back and look at those recurring tenets, you're going to see an awful lot of overlap in what Bhavya was showing with the policy issues, like planetary protection. That falls under responsible use as well as a recurring tenet. And so what that's going to translate to, Jeff, is that going forward, there's going to be a process that we're grading ourselves against, like how are we doing against the objectives? Also, how do the elements and the things that we were doing when you decompose these all the like right to left, these things over here on the actual execution side, how do those play against those recurring tenets, which are also going to be hand in hand with the policy issues? So there's a bit of a grading that's going to be happening as we look back at the solution space, back at the objectives, recurring tenets, and I think I'm going to put the recurring tenets are kind of going to go very similarly with the policy considerations that Bhavya is talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree with Spuds. We have to work in pretty integrated team ways to make sure that we're not just 2 parallel tracks. An example would be, and again, one for which we do not have an answer, we did a workshop on the ethics of Artemis, and there were some participants, and we are just collecting data for the moment, outside participants, There were some that raised the issue of that it is offensive to them to bury human remains or cremated remains on the moon. Well, there's a company that wants to do that. And again, maybe not NASA's problem per se, but as a community, we do need to think about how are we going to address this issue. It isn't one way or the other. We need to figure out a way to work together to see how we can move forward. So a lot of big challenges, but I think as Spuds has said, constancy and unity of purpose. We need to communicate what we are trying to do, why we are trying to do it, and hopefully we will have a common ways path forward.
Spud, you mentioned that this next round of the architecture concept review is going to look at that human to Mars segment. So what would we expect to come out of that in terms of, identifying specific programs or technologies or things that, identify you need to pursue in order to enable that segment?
Yeah, this is where the patience thing comes in as well, because, right, big time, because I thought what you were going to ask is more details about like what else or what's that going to entail. I would say the details of what they're going through, and they're doing this right now. Jim Free's deputy, Kathy Kerner, is also the chief architect for ESDMD, and she's got a very strong team of folks from multiple centers that are represented by multiple centers that lead that architecting effort. They're not doing it in a silo, though, I should say that. This is done across the directorates. There are representatives from different directorates involved in the mission architecture, and ESDMD is basically communicating that. But I want to caution against the second part of actually where you did go with that question, which is where is that going to lead to the tech solutions? I get it. And the same thing, actually, we get the same thing with the centers within NASA. They see, okay, as we're building out that wireframe, they want to get to the mosaic. They want to know what color, okay, which I'm the yellow blocks, so which ones am I going to do? That's why they started in the first segment with human lunar return, because they're close in. Those are the missions that are the closest in. We know we have to be on the technology solution paths for that. What we're doing now, especially with the Mars aspect, is we have to put bets down. The tech development people have to put bets down on what kinds of technologies we're going to need to set ourselves up for that in the future. So I think those are the kinds of questions we should expect to get answered in this short ACR period. The other thing I want to say is I would also encourage us not to expect the final answer on Mars in this ACR, because not only is it short, it's really early. We're going to hit Mars over and over and over again and keep refining this answer. That's why they call it an evolutionary architecture process. It's still guided by the overall goals and objectives. Those won't change. But the solution space is going to evolve as new technology insights come along and we have new realizations about what's possible that could augment what we do as we go forward and still meet the objectives and the overall goals.
Mm-hmm. And feeding that into technologies that you can then test on the moon.
Yeah, exactly the same thing. So there are technologies we know about right now that we know that we want to do analog activity. It's always going to be a little bit different. The moon's different than Mars, but there are some activities that we should be able to at least have lessons learned. ISRU, the in situ research utilization. It's not exactly the same because the regolith's different, the processes could be different, but there are lessons that we're going to learn in that process that are going to attack some of the problems we could run into in a Mars scenario. So I think and we already know that's out there. So the space tech people are already working those kind of building up the technologies so that we can do that and practice that and learn the lessons and stub our toe a little bit on the moon and prepare us and that helps us answer some questions that we'll run into and give us a head start for Mars.
Bhavya, when you're looking through these policy issues, what sort of outside input are you getting? Are you talking to others in the government, outside of government, in terms of, what sort of, insights or inputs are you getting to help determine what the issues are and what the potential solutions are?
So this is a process we have just started. So step one was just within NASA, colleagues from human exploration or exploration systems, space technology, science, making sure that we have the technical people who are down in the trenches giving us the input. Next step would be to maybe bring our government partners, Department of Transportation, Commerce, Department of Defense, and others, and then our international partners. So that's kind of one stream that we are going to engage in. But on the ethics piece, actually, as I told you, we have already started to bring input from outside NASA. So, we just had a workshop where we had experts, domestic experts, right? People in the United States. We would like to repeat that kind of workshop potentially at the IAC and get our international partners to be weighing in. So it is absolutely important to bring, just like, the technology, the technical team went out and got inputs, vetted and updated. I hope that we will do something very similar with policy and make sure that we are, robust with respect to, things that are feasible. And, a lot of policy implications may have a cost associated with it, right? I mean, if we raise or lower the bar for, let's say, planetary protection, there's a cost implication. So these are going to be very difficult decisions that are going to be made by us as a community.
I've got one more question. I'm going to ask Spuds here. Then I'm going to turn it to the audience. So this is your cue to cue, so to speak, to line up at the microphones. Sort of, a similar question. I know there is a formal process for getting feedback from industry and from international partners. Maybe talk a little bit about how that will work, particularly as you go into this next round of the architecture review.
Yeah, this one, it's challenged again because it's such a short ACR cycle this time. They just got started on ACR 23, and the announcements that were made at the Space Symposium about the workshop, the next round of workshops, was made at a Space Symposium, which is just last month, and we got to put those on, and we've got to put them on for the new round, the international and the industry/academia. We've got to figure out how to get those in a time that they're timely from a standpoint of we've got enough baked on ACR 23 that we've got something to talk about, something new to show, yet at the same time, it's not so late that we don't have time to get the input and churn on it. It's going to be kind of close, which means that just for this 1 year, the data is going to be there, but it's still going to be very heavily processed. We're going to learn some lessons on the process side. We started the workshop activities last summer. I mentioned there were 4 campaigns. We did a gap analysis internally with the Federated Board. We did a workforce campaign. We did a industry and academia, which culminated as a workshop in Houston, and then last summer, and then we did an international workshop in London with our international partners, and those were very fruitful. Like I said, we've got 5,000 inputs from those, and I don't expect to get that volume every time because that was the initial set, but we are very desirous of making sure that we have this steady cadence. And by the way, it doesn't have to be limited to the lead-ups to these workshops. There's a portal that's going to be out there that ESDMD is running that will be able to have an interaction with the community to make sure that we're constantly in contact. The communication works both ways. We need to be listening. We also need to be transmitting and explaining what it is we've got going on. So it's an annual. I would imagine this isn't set because it's going to be run out of ESDMD for how they're going to actually mechanize this. But we're going to have. It's going to start with a webinar, I believe. I'd heard they were going to start with a webinar sometime next week, which is really soon, and then the workshops are going to be in June, both the industry as well as the international. So the details on that are not out yet that I'm aware of. I think they had some dates that they were already working with, but I don't know what's been announced, so I won't even attempt to try to announce them. But I would imagine that at a minimum there'll be an annual cadence of these workshops, perhaps. And then in between those workshops, there's a way to engage with NASA on the portal, similar to what started off our workshop process last year as well.
All right, great. So let's see, if we have any questions in the audience here. Looks like we may have someone coming up to the microphone. All right, yes, sir.
Yes. Where are we going to go after Mars if we have planned at all?
That's a really good question. You'll notice on that artwork, the first and last slide that I had up there on the charts, that's actually the same cover for the strategy document. If you got a picture of the QR code, the 2 planets, it shows the progression from the lunar surface to the Mars surface, and there's 2 planets up there in the upper left-hand side. Oh, thanks. That's the very last slide. If you go Go forward, 2 more. I guess I have the clicker. There we go. I think that's Titan in Europa. Right? That is not NASA saying that's where we're going. Be very clear. I'm just saying, though, but we say the next destinations, that whole blueprint was just that. It's a blueprint. We're going to demonstrate this blueprint on Mars and do that whole sustained as well as prepare for the next domain, whatever that is. We just threw those out there as examples, but those we don't know. And I bet you, come back, when we do this, I said this is almost like a decadal kind of thing. When we do this next round of objectives and goals, they're going to be modified a little bit. Those 63 will probably be a little bit different next decade when we do this. And maybe we'll have a better answer on what comes next, what the plans are for the future.
Got a question? Oh, go ahead.
Can I also answer that?
Yes.
So I think it depends also on whether we go as humans in these human bodies versus as machines, right? If it's with these human bodies, it's going to be more complicated to go beyond, deep space, right? I mean, it just takes so long to get to anywhere beyond. I mean, even Mars is 2 to 3 year round trip, right? So going beyond that would be even harder. However, if we went as robots, I think we can go, interstellar space. Why not? So.
Over here.
There, Crystal Puka, I'm a mission architect with Northrop Grumman. One of the things you mentioned was how we're getting into this new approach of purchasing data that is being acquired, and I know that kind of falls into this new approach of NASA leasing some of these systems as opposed to purchasing them straight out. That's kind of a new approach that we've been seeing in the industry. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was, as we've been moving towards this new approach of contracts with industry, what have been some of the benefits and downfalls of this new contract approach?
So I would say the only caution I would give is that, and I know that on one hand, because of like commercial crew, commercial cargo, that there is this new public-private partnership, and that has shown some successes. Keep in mind too that in the launch business, we know that business very well. It's easy to do services contracts when there's not a lot of there's development that's still happening. It's more challenging, in my view. I spent 32 years on the Department of Defense side of the things. Doing services contracts on things where you need a lot of development is a lot more challenging, right? So there's a caution there. So I would hesitate. I'm not speaking for NASA. This is not the official position. I don't know that we have that there is a complete shift that's the way everything's going to be at NASA from now on. I suspect it's going to be a balance. I think there's going to be a balance of some of the more traditional ways as well as more of that new approach. Having said all that, remember the caution I said as well is that the objectives and the goals were established devoid of the specific technology solutions or acquisition approaches that we'd use. So I would say that I'm not the person, I think Bhavya and I, neither of us would be the people to stand up here and tell you how that's going to play out. That's something that's got to happen in the future through the folks that are going to actually execute on those acquisition approaches, ESDMD, STMD for the space tech part, and SMD for the science. As far as the pitfall, anything that's gone well or hasn't gone, I know commercial crew and commercial cargo has been very successful. And so I think there's a lot of lessons learned in a positive way of how you can leverage those experiences to change a paradigm for those things that we don't have a ton of development to do. But it also is a caution that we need to be aware of when we do have a lot of development to do, to be careful about how we press forward and not just that's just my personal view, be careful about just doing a wholesale cut over and everything's now services. That could be just things to be careful of, that's all.
And even when you do, there are still a lot of questions that need to be resolved. So for example, if we purchase data from a company, can we then share it freely with our international partners? Because those companies would like to resell it to others. So there, even if we make the decision after all the considerations that Spuds mentioned, it is still a pretty complicated issue. Luckily, NASA has some of the best, the most forward-leaning thinkers in the world, legal procurement, and they. In retrospect, COTS, commercial cargo and commercial crew seem like, well, what's a big deal? But there was a lot of effort and a lot of thinking to even make those come to fruition. So there would be similar effort and a similar kind of due diligence for any other future activities on data buys.
All right, over here.
Hey, Spuds, Bhavya. This is a multi-factor question for both of you. Spuds, I heard you speak at LSIC a few months ago. When can we kind of expect the integrated master plan and schedule to start rolling out? First question. Bhavya, second question. How can that then be balanced out in parallel with policy to make sure that the stepping stones match the overall long-term, ebb and flow of things? And then third question, Spuds, I think I got to mention this to you. Where does search and rescue kind of fit in the overall architecture? Is that habitat and transportation? And where can we kind of see that getting integrated? Steve Dare, Comfers co-chairman, Hopkins, APL, and Grumman systems engineer. Thank you.
Copy all. Thanks for the questions. The first one, I'm gonna cop out on you, because that's going to be a Kathy Kerner and her team's answering that question when that comes out. I know that that's something that they're working on. So Najud Moranci, if you know Najud, that's all between her and Amit, the program manager for Moon to Mars. That's the things that they have to produce. I couldn't speak to it. I couldn't tell you what the timeline's going to be on that. I apologize. You want me to answer the third question, or you want to do the second one?
Go for it.
So where does SAR fit in? So in the recurring tenants, I believe it's recurring tenant 3 or 2 is it's 3. The return crew safely, right? Nested inside that, we actually teased this out a lot about what the crew safety kind of thing. I would imagine it kind of fits. We're gonna be graded against that in there. It's gonna find itself not as a dedicated capability, bless you. It's not going to be a dedicated thing. I think it's going to find itself in elements scattered throughout the solution space as we decompose at each level. When you get to the objectives and sub-objectives, when you get down into that, I think that's where you're going to find, and if there's a dedicated need for particular activities, that's where it's going to have to be a derivative off of that. Right now, I'll tell you that's not, at least not that I'm aware of, this a dedicated, we need this XYZ capability. Is that fair?
Yeah, that hits the nail on the head. Thank you.
I think if I remember, the second question was how do we make sure that the policy issues kind of stay interwoven with the technical decision, and I'm assuming your point is that they don't slow down decision making. I absolutely 100% agree. We need to be working pretty closely with the technical teams to make sure that we identify policy issues ahead of time and have a sort of the trade space of options that the technical teams and our leadership will consider to make decisions. So an example might be, I don't know, advanced purchase commitments, right? Will we buy nuclear power or power on the moon? What are the policy considerations? Would we buy commercial communication services in cislunar space? Those are the kind of policy issues that I'm thinking about. And again, they're complicated, and we just need to, work through them. And there's no way around. Sort of start at the bottom and work your way up. But I think the key is to identify them ahead of time, as opposed to at the last minute saying, "Oh crap, we didn't think about that," right? So that's kind of, I think, what we are trying to do. We are trying to make sure that we head off any surprises going forward.
All right. The countdown clock has become a count up clock, and Chris is going to lock us in if we, not let us out if we go too much longer. But I do want to appreciate all of you taking the time here. I hope you understand a little bit better some of this architecture work and how this feeds into this goal of sending humans to Mars. So thank you very much.